Okay, we have
some attendees.
Hi, welcome to our third virtual privacy book club. We'll just give it another minute or so people could dial in. Hi, welcome to our third book club, and thank you so much for joining today. And we will be discussing Architects of Intelligence by Martin Ford. And we are very excited to have the author join us right now, and we will hear from him momentarily. And some housekeeping notes, we will first hear from the author, and then you can ask questions. And we have some expert panelists who can talk more about AI and their thoughts on the book. And the rest of the book club is all open for you for discussion. If you have any questions or comments on the book or any questions that you have on AI in general, please use the chat box in Zoom, which is in the bottom of the Zoom platform. And if you would like to be on video or talk on the phone, please let us know by raising your hand or using the chat box, and we will have you on live. And now I will turn it to Jeremy, who will introduce the author and our panelists.
My name is Jeremy Greenberg. I am a policy fellow here at Future of Privacy Forum. And I will now ask our fantastic panel of experts to introduce themselves. First, we will start with Michael Veale, who is calling in all the way from the UK, I believe. Michael, please introduce yourself.
Cool. Hi, I'm Michael Veale. I'm a researcher at University College London and an honorary research fellow at Birmingham Law School. I work in the crossover of machine learning, social issues, and the law. So I look at how public sector organizations today are deploying these systems, how they cope with issues of bias, fairness, transparency, and how regulations are or are not at tension or are or are not successfully regulating the ill effects that we might see about machine learning technologies in the wild.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. And now I will ask Mark MacCarthy, who is in studio with us, to introduce himself.
I'm here in person. So I'm Mark MacCarthy. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Law, Technology, Law, and Policy at Georgetown Law, and also a senior policy fellow at the Center for Business and Public Policy at Georgetown. And I teach some classes on AI and ethics issues for some undergraduates and also for graduate students in the Communication, Culture, and Technology program at Georgetown. And previously, I was Senior Vice President for Public Policy at the Software and Information Industry Association.
Great, thank you very much. We will also be hearing from Brenda Leong, who is a policy counsel here at FPF. Brenda had a prior speaking engagement, so she will be joining us shortly. And I am now very pleased to introduce our author, Martin Ford, self-described futurist and author of the book we're going to be discussing today, titled Architects of Intelligence, The Truth About AI from the People Building It. Take it away, Mr. Ford.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate you all coming and listening. Let me start by just telling you a bit about my background. I've been focused on artificial intelligence and robotics for more than 10 years now. Mostly my interest has been in its impact potentially on the economy and the job market. And I wrote my first book on this subject way back in 2009. And then in 2015, I published Rise of the Robots, which is the book that has really gotten the most attention. And that book is really focused on the potential for unemployment, as a result of the automation that I think is going to evolve out of AI and robotics. This book, Architects of Intelligence, is a bit different. It came into being because the publisher of the book in the United Kingdom actually approached me and suggested this idea to me, and I thought that it was a terrific idea. And the basic concept of the book is that I talk to what are, I think by any measure, the smartest people working in artificial intelligence. and actually talk to them about what they're doing and what they think about the future of AI, and what they also think about the challenges and the risks and the opportunities that that field is going to bring. And I think this is really important because, you know, as I said, I've been working on this now for 10 years. And one thing that I think anyone would acknowledge is that there's just really been an explosion in interest and to some extent hype around artificial intelligence. I mean, when I started writing about this back in 2009, this was really completely off the radar. Certainly the idea that it might have an impact on the job market and create unemployment was really at that time kind of a taboo issue almost. It was the kind of thing that would get you labeled a neo-Luddite. But since then, things have really changed quite dramatically, and now even some professional economists are quite concerned about the impact on employment. And of course, there's been this whole range of other issues that have come to the forefront as AI has advanced, and certainly privacy is one of the most important ones, but there are many, many other ethical issues involving weaponization, bias and algorithms and so forth that are really getting a lot of attention. And perhaps most notably, you've now got people like Elon Musk in particular, and also the late Stephen Hawking, that were warning about a potential existential threat from artificial intelligence. In other words, the kinds of things that you've seen in the movies like The Matrix and The Terminator are now being genuinely worried about, right? By some very, very smart, people that probably deserve to be listened to. So the basic idea behind this book is to really cut through some of the speculation that you see out there, often from people that are not AI experts, and really talk to the people that literally know the most about this subject, the people that are truly building these technologies, and try to really get some insight into how this technology is likely to evolve, what the risks and challenges and opportunities are, and maybe from my perspective, most importantly, to figure out what should we really worry about, what things are really just over the top in terms of being concerned about in terms of artificial intelligence, and what things, should we genuinely really be concerned about, and maybe really be calling for regulation or government involvement and so forth in order to manage these risks. And so I talked to 23 people. And again, I do think that they are truly, I started this project in my mind with kind of a list of people that I thought would be really important. And I can say honestly that there isn't anyone that I really, really thought was important to include that I didn't ultimately manage to get to participate. So I was really excited about that. So it's got people like Demis Hassabis, right, the CEO of DeepMind, who built AlphaGo and AlphaZero, the systems that maybe have the highest profile in terms of moving us toward artificial general intelligence, or a true thinking machine. People like Jeff Hinton, who is maybe the single most important person in the whole story of deep learning, the technology that is really becoming transformative, along with Jan LeCun and the other people that have worked in this field. Ray Kurzweil, of course, a person that many people have heard of in terms of being a futurist and having a long involvement in the future of artificial intelligence. So these are really amazing people. I thought it was a fascinating series of conversations. I really tried to make them very wide-ranging. So we talk about the nuts and the bolts of the technology, the details, some of which is maybe a little bit dense for people who are not truly into artificial intelligence and machine learning and fields like that, but then also talked about the future implications of the technology and the risks and opportunities and so forth. And I think that that's really important. So I'm really happy with the way the book turned out. What I would say though is that there is not by any sense a central theme to the book. There's, what it really is a series of conversations. And one of the most important takeaways for me is that there is not wide agreement on a lot of these issues. I mean, I think virtually everyone agrees that AI is incredibly important, that it's going to be disruptive, transformative. I mean, I think I didn't talk to anyone who didn't, buy into that idea to some extent. But beyond that, there's not a lot of agreement in terms of the pace at which this will progress. In particular, one thing I was really interested in was the path toward, human level AI or what's called artificial general intelligence. And I asked everyone for kind of an informal guess at when that might happen. And in the back of the book, you'll find a summary of those results. And the main takeaway is that there's a massive disagreement. You've got Ray Kurzweil saying it's going to be 10 years and we're going to have a thinking machine. You've got Rodney Brooks saying it's going to be almost 200 years. So that's really the extent of the disagreement there. And I think that range of opinions and predictions from literally, again, the smartest people in the world working on these technologies and the people that we should believe know the most and ought to be able to make the best predictions, there's just massive disagreement. So, and that's also true in terms of the risks that people are concerned with. So many people are really quite dismissive of the idea that maybe machines and AI could genuinely threaten us someday. I would say most people are quite dismissive of that, at least for the foreseeable future. But others are very concerned. I talked to Stuart Russell, who is a professor at UC Berkeley and is particularly concerned about weaponization in the near term, and it made this amazing video that you can find on YouTube called Slaughterbots, which talks all about the potential for autonomous weapons and how that could be truly a terrifying scenario. And I think that's really something that we should worry about. So it's really an amazing range of perspectives from people. I did talk about the specific issue of privacy to many people. In particular, I tended to raise the specter of the kind of society that's being built in China, right? We're using facial recognition and the impact of that on China. And I think that's becoming a very real concern that is going to be one of the most important ethical issues going forward. And it's not just going to be in China. Clearly, that technology is rolling out to many different countries. More authoritarian countries are certainly more open to it. I can tell you a story. Just last week, I was in Dubai. And as you know, the United Arab Emirates is not really a democracy. So it's a country that is a bit more open to these kinds of technologies than a lot of other Western countries would be. But I heard a story there of a woman who lost a very expensive ring. She just dropped it on the ground somewhere. And then a short while later, someone else came along and picked that ring up and put it in her pocket. And the facial recognition technology there, which I believe is probably imported from China, was able to identify this person that picked up the ring. And so within a couple of hours, the police showed up at her house to ask her, what's going on with that. So that's a pretty, I think, vibrant demonstration of just how powerful this technology is going to be and the impact that it's going to begin to have really in countries throughout the world. And I think that's going to be a very important debate for the democratic world, for the West, in terms of what trade-offs do we want to make in terms of having technologies like this really begin to impact our society. So I think these are just incredibly important issues, and I hope that this book really provides some insight into the thinking of basically the top minds in the field in terms of how these issues are going to progress. So I think that's about what I want to say about it. I'll stop there, and maybe I'm of course happy to answer any questions or engage in discussion about the book.
Yeah, thank you for the great overview of the book, and I totally agree with you. These are really great insights of the top 23 minds in AI. We have a question from one of our readers, Greg. Who was the most informative interviewee or most confident? Of course, you already talked about the interviewees already, but were there a couple that fit in your mind?
I certainly wouldn't point to one, and all the interviews to my mind were fascinating. Obviously, I talked to different people with different focuses. I would say the single most issue that I find particularly fascinating is the path toward artificial general intelligence or a true thinking machine. I mean, I think that's the kind of holy grail of the field. It's the thing that almost everyone that works in artificial intelligence probably dreams of, the idea that we're going to build a true thinking machine. And there were 2 or 3 interviews that really focused a lot on that, and I found really fascinating. One was with Demis Hassabis, who as you know, is the leader of DeepMind, and he's got a particular way of viewing this, that the path to AGI is going to be inspired by the human mind. It's not going to be a reverse engineering at the detailed level of the, or a simulation of the human mind, but rather he's going to take the ideas that come from the brain and build them into a system based on deep learning that's going to progress toward that point. And I think that he gave a really fascinating overview of how he views that. Another person that is kind of focused on the same challenge is David Ferrucci, who is the guy that led the team that built IBM Watson, right? So he's also got a very, very aggressive viewpoint about how we can get to artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence. He's much more aggressive than many other people in terms of how long it might take to get there, but he has a very different vision. He believes it can be done based on an understanding of human language. And this, of course, grows out of what was done with Watson, which of course was heavily focused on natural language processing. But he doesn't believe that we need to, necessarily understand how the human mind works and worry so much about those details. We have the technology already, the basic know-how already, in terms of our understanding of language, and that can provide a path to intelligence. He's actually running a startup called Elemental Cognition, which is focused on that as well. And then the third one I point to is Ray Kurzweil, which is he's focused on many of the other issues and is, just really well known in terms of being a futurist with some ideas that I think are very outlandish. But one thing that really came through from me talking to Ray is that he's extraordinarily, focused on what he's doing, and he has a deep understanding of the technology he's working on. He's not someone that is just a kind of a futurist saying crazy stuff. He really understands the nuts and bolts of the technology that he's working on, and he's got his own perspective on the path toward AGI, and he's also very aggressive about when that's likely to happen within 10 years. So those are the 3 interviews that perhaps I enjoyed the most, but I would encourage everyone to read all of them. I think they're really fascinating, and these are really just incredible people that it was really an extraordinary privilege for me to get to talk to.
Great. So we have another question in the chat, and this question is, what are the most overlooked or maybe underestimated risks that AI poses, and what would the realizations of these threats look like?
Well, I will say that right now there's a tremendous amount of emphasis on this existential threat, and that comes because you've got people like Elon Musk that have got this extraordinarily high profile talking about it. And I think that that's not something that should be dismissed. I think it's a genuine concern. I think it's good that a lot of really smart people are working on that, but I also think it's pretty far in the future, and it distracts us from the much more immediate issues. And excuse me, the single most important issue that I've really focused on is the issue on employment. I do think that there is potential eventually for a lot of jobs to be automated. And that has the potential to eventually result in outright unemployment, or even if not that, underemployment and massive inequality, even beyond what we see already. And I think that is something that ultimately could tear apart the fabric of society. And I think it's really incredibly important that we begin to focus on that. So it has one. The other one is the potential for the impact on privacy, certainly. As I mentioned, what's happening in China, I think that this is something that can easily get ahead of us, and we could end up living in something that is a very Orwellian society sort of almost overnight, before we're ready to really confront the implications of that. Weaponization is certainly another area that I'm very concerned about. What people working in the field, really worry about is not just that militaries will begin to use artificial intelligence, because I think that's probably inevitable, but that the weaponized technology, autonomous weapons, cheap drones that can swarm and attack people, maybe hundreds of them together, that these kinds of technologies will become widely available. That the kinds of arms dealers that now sell machine guns in the Middle East or in Africa are going to make available these technologies as well, and they will, from that perspective, fall into the hands of some very bad people. And I think this is a genuine concern, because this is coming at us much sooner than this existential threat of true artificial intelligence. This is something that within a couple of years, we're going to see it. So we really need to begin to prepare for these challenges. Bias is another one. I mean, we already see artificial intelligence used in hiring, and there have been proven cases of these algorithms having gender bias or racial bias, things like that. So, these are concerns that a lot of people that I talk to are very focused on, but they're very real issues, that really need to be a part of the public discussion, I think.
Yeah, we totally agree. And since we're the Privacy Book Club and we are all interested in privacy, I think those concerns are also some important points. And we have one more question for you from Michael. Here's a question about on algorithms and AI. Are these data sets usually anonymized?
Not always, no. I mean, a lot of the data sets contain information which could be very sensitive. I think, all of that kind of stuff is something that is probably going to be space for regulation. How are we going to protect people's individual, privacy and their sensitive information? Because I think that different companies have different approaches to that. Obviously, Apple has got a much more privacy-centric approach to the way they handle data than many other companies. But there really is not an overall standard out there. So there is information out there that we should be concerned about as an individual, about the kind of information that you're sharing. There's also, of course, security issues. We were talking about one of the main threats. That's one I overlooked. That could be the single most important concern with the advance of artificial intelligence is security. The fact that as systems become more autonomous, as there are people not so much in the loop controlling these things, that those systems then become susceptible to hacking. And that raises a whole lot of issues in terms of, obviously, the data that's there that could be stolen is one thing, but also the security of systems that are actually running the world, right? And someone could hack into those systems and get them to do bad things or bring them to a stop. I mean, one example I always give is, imagine we've someday got self-driving trucks delivering critical resources, our food, for example, and then someone hacks into that and brings that system to a halt. I mean, that would be catastrophic, right? So the whole security issue, both in terms of protecting sensitive data and in terms of protecting these systems against hacking, from someone that could potentially do nefarious things, I think is maybe the single most important risk or concern that comes along with advancing artificial intelligence and our increasing reliance on it.
Thank you very much for your
Yeah, thank you very much. And we want to bring our other panelists in. If you all have any thoughts on that question or any of our other questions, please weigh in with your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to say something about this. Yeah, well, I mean, thanks for the great book, and it must be a lot of work chasing everybody down and asking them a lot of questions. I think one thing that really stood out, which is really nice, is because you were rigorous in asking similar questions to a lot of people as a sort of pedagogical tool for the book. People see the same answer from different perspectives, and it's all fleshed out gradually throughout. And I think that really works very well as a technique to kind of get people into the field and explain it. One thing that is interesting to look at some of the gaps, maybe things that weren't often mentioned in the interviews, not really because you didn't ask them, but because it wasn't what kind of came to mind. And indeed, data, one of the questions from the previous questioner, data and the sources of data were very rarely mentioned. These researchers were often talking about the benefit of having time, being grad students, being free to think about fundamentally changing issues, think about things in different ways, and not just be doing a master's degree and tied to industry. Yet they're also in extremely privileged situations, of course. They're part of large tech firms with large centralized data sets. And not only are these data sets being used in research and perhaps helping create interesting tools that way, but it was also not hugely emphasized by the interviewees, I think, how some of the research made its way into products. or if it did or didn't, and the kind of pathway between this unusual kind of new renaissance of the industrial lab to say we've got, you know, like Bell Labs obviously was a famous industrial lab that produced many things, including in machine learning, like support vector machines. However, we've now got this new genesis of an industrial lab sitting inside and aside big tech firms and interfacing with products, interfacing with data, interfacing with what companies see themselves as doing in several years' time and back and forth. And I wonder, and it's sort of, yeah, to everyone in the book club, but also to the author, how that will change. We talk a lot about how the technology might fly away and change in the future, but actually this relationship between research and practice and business models is very, very new and changing very, very rapidly. And I wonder if either Martin or someone else has something to say in relation to AI and business models and research.
Yeah, I'll say a couple words on that. I think, you know, if there's a Bell Labs today, I guess it's Google, right? I mean, that's where this convergence is happening between the research and practical products. You know, I said Google and Facebook and Baidu and those companies are really being kind of that gateway, and it's happening because Google went out and hired the best researchers in the world, and they have worked on turning that into a practical product. For example, TensorFlow, right? But I think the biggest thing that happens from this point is that technology then becomes democratized, and a couple of the people I talked to, like Fei Li, did talk a lot about this. I think that one really important thing that's happening is that the machine learning core technology is being built into the cloud computing platforms, you know, provided by Google and also, of course, Amazon and Microsoft, and that then becomes the mechanism by which, you know, a million other startup companies that are doing other things in terms of their business models are going to access this technology. And I think the day will come when you don't necessarily need to have a PhD in machine learning or something in order to do that. The tools are going to get so easy to use that even people with lower skill levels are going to be able to take these technologies and apply them to a range of, you know, basically a Cambrian explosion of different applications. And I think that that's the point at which, as I've said, and Andrew Ng also said this, that AI is going to become like electricity, right? It's going to be a utility. It's going to really scale across everything. And that's one of the most important mechanisms that's going to enable that.
I think just briefly to sort of respond to that, yeah, I completely agree. Model trading and model use is a direction, or already we see companies integrating this. However, it does raise the question, and in relation to the title of the book, Architects of AI, in this model, in Google's AutoML model, for example, it is Google that control and own the largest, most important model, which is then remains proprietary. And they allow it to be augmented, and they allow it to be accessed as a service, but it is still them that are architects of an underlying system, but you then have people who might be new architects of an applied system within companies. And there's an interesting question there that I think arises about responsibility. The overarching system may not inherently be fit for purpose. It's designed for many companies. It's designed to optimize for certain things and not for others. And so you've got kind of different levels of architecture. And to what extent a business has really got to take it or leave it with some of these technologies, and where the ability to scope the problem that you're applying AI to actually starts to fall. I mean, you've got architects at different levels there. And even if you can deploy it very cheaply and easily through an API or through drag and drop programming language, you do wonder whether you have the control over it that you need to deal with issues like bias and even issues like safety, but probably more bias, transparency, accountability, and these challenges.
And Mark, would you like to weigh in on any of this?
So let me say first of all that I thought the book was the right book at the right time. This is a point, I think, where historians will look back and say, what was going on in AI around this particular point in time? And this is the book they're going to read to find it out, because it does capture a range of issues, not everything, but in a range of issues where the field is right now, in a way that's accessible not to the specialists, not to the business people, not to the sociologists, but to the general public. What's actually going on there? Now, it doesn't touch on every question. There was a clear editorial selection to pick on certain topics. But the really good thing was that I thought, Martin, I think you picked the topics that the people you were talking about knew the most about. There is an area where they may not be the best people to opine. How are we going to fix bias in algorithms? Probably not their issue because it's really a social problem, not a technical problem. How are we going to fix employment? We raised that a little bit, but that's really not their expertise, and they don't have much to say about it. Regulation, same thing. They don't really have an area of real knowledge and expertise in that area. But the fight between the learning folk and the rules folk, now that's something that they're very familiar with. It's been going on in the field for 50, 60 years, and it's still going on. And you brought out that even with the wonderful advances in machine learning, that's still a point of contention within the field. AGI, yes or no? For some people, it's what artificial intelligence is, and anything less is sort of, narrow engineering. It's not worth the name of artificial intelligence at all. And yet that there was this wide diversity of opinion on what artificial intelligence might be all about and whether it's achievable in the short term or the long term. The control problem, again, there's a lot of speculation in the field on it. Everyone's got a view on it. And I thought it was great that you brought out the divergence of opinion on that. The one area where a lot of the scientists are focused is what to do about autonomous weapons, where they feel that there has to be some sort of moral position taken by the profession. And you got Stuart Russell to talk a little bit about that. So I thought this was a great survey of important issues that really needed to be put in one place. And I thought you did a great job in doing that. There's one almost philosophical question that I wanted to raise with you, and I wondered why this wasn't an issue. And it maybe was because you were talking to the architects of intelligence rather than to the philosophers. But for years and years and years, there's been a debate whether the whole project really makes sense, whether there's a conceptual confusion involved in the project of finding a machine that could be intelligent. And it goes back to John Searle and the famous Chinese room experiment, where you say, imagine that a person inside of a room who gets these little pieces of paper, and on the little pieces of paper are written squiggles, and he doesn't understand at all what the squiggles are, but his job is to look up in a big book what you're supposed to do to hand back to the people on the outside of the room when you get a piece of paper with these squiggles on it. And so he looks up in the book and he says, oh, I got this piece of paper. It says I'm supposed to return this one. And he returns the other piece of paper out from the room. And it turns out that that's a language. It's words written in Chinese. And the piece of paper that comes from the outside is a question. And the piece of paper that's responded to is an appropriate answer. And Searle says, well, that means that although he's gotten all the answers roughly right, you still clearly have no intelligence in the system. No one knows how to speak Chinese in that inside of the box. It's not the box that knows how to do it. It's not the person. As far as they're concerned, it's just syntax. It's just a matter of passing pieces of paper back and forth. No one that you talk to raised that as a conceptual obstacle to the goal of artificial general intelligence. They thought it could be achieved slowly or quickly using machine learning or using rules-based systems or using some sort of hybrid. Reinforcement learning might be the key. Maybe it's just more, deep learning, but it will get there. The only question is how soon. And the real question I wanted to pose to you is, what do you think was missing from this? Is it really a conceptual confusion that they're embarked on, or is it something that is an achievable goal? And they're perfectly right to ignore this kind of objection from a philosopher like John Searle.
Well, you're right. I mean, I didn't examine that question. I think part of the answer is that everyone working in artificial intelligence, the people that have devoted their lives and their careers to this challenge, they all have pretty much one perspective on this, right? I think they virtually all believe that it's possible, and that we will someday build an intelligent machine. I have to say for my own sake that I also share that. So I guess I have the same bias. I mean, my assumption, my feeling has always been that intelligence is probably substrate independent, right? If it works in a biological machine in our brain, and there's no particular reason it won't work in some other medium. I've never been particularly concerned by that Chinese box scenario that you described, because I think it's ultimately it's a question of the sort of the level of abstraction, isn't it? If you're outside the box, then there appears to be intelligence, and you're pointing out that if you go inside and you look at the details of what's happening inside that box or that room, then there's no real intelligence. But isn't the same exact thing true of the human brain? If you zoom in and you're looking at some very nuts and bolts level of individual neurons firing, clearly there's not going to be intelligence at that level, right? You have to go out to look from the outside before, at some point the intelligence appears kind of holistically, right? So I've never felt that there's this conflict there. I don't see really the difference. So my view is that AI is possible, and ultimately probably will be achieved.
So then, if I could follow up just quickly on that, I think that my students agree with you, by the way. Every time I try this argument on them, they all look at me as though I'm from outer space, and who would think of such a silly argument? So it does have a certain air of implausibility when you sketch it out. But doesn't that then create the significant worry about the control problem? I mean, once you buy the idea that artificial general intelligence is only a matter of time, then suddenly that's not a crazy issue, because the artificial general intelligence you're going to develop will be enormously better than the human mind at a whole range of things, and it can recursively improve itself in ways that could become threatening. And once you do take this step, AGI is possible. And it's not just narrow artificial intelligence, that it can play chess, or it can play Go, or it can play two-person full information games, but it can do the whole range of things that human beings can do. Then you do have the problem of how to set its incentives properly, so that it won't come up with a different perspective on what life is all about and what objectives it should be achieving. Doesn't that really make the control problem a real problem?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that it's a real problem. And I always say that it's not something that should be dismissed or laughed at, and which can be difficult because we've seen the problem in the Terminator movie, right? And we've seen it in many instances of science fiction, and that makes it, I think that makes it very hard for, imagine, a politician or someone to talk seriously about that problem without looking ridiculous, right? So I think it is a genuine concern. I'm quite happy with the fact that Elon Musk has created OpenAI, that at Oxford you have the Future of Humanity Institute. You've got very, very smart people working on this problem. But what I believe is that the current allocation of resources to this problem, and mostly in the private sector, privately funded, is appropriate to challenge. I would not say we need to expand this and make this a huge government endeavor. We want Donald Trump tweeting about super intelligence. I think we don't want to go to that extent. I think it's very good the way it is now, that we've got some smart people that are working seriously on this problem. I don't think we want this still relatively futuristic, I think, problem, although obviously I could be wrong about that if Ray Kurzweil is correct and it's only 10 years out. But I don't think we want this problem to distract us from the other more immediate issues that clearly are going to happen and will be confronting us, within 3 years, 5 years, 10 years at the most. And that's issues like, weaponization, privacy, security, and the impact on employment, and as well as bias, for example. These are all things that are coming at us clearly, and we don't want to lose sight of those immediate issues because we're so focused on this bigger issue. So that, I do take it very seriously. That's the reason I talk to every single person in the book about this, and they have a range of opinions. Some are, in fact, quite dismissive, and I wouldn't agree with that level of being so dismissive. Just one other point about your earlier discussion of whether our intelligence is possible. One question I did ask quite a few people that is kind of related to that, which I think is very fascinating, is the question of consciousness. Would a machine be intelligent and also conscious, and do those things come coupled together, or are they separate? And most people believe they are in fact separate, so that you could potentially have a super intelligent zombie, right? A machine that was intelligent but actually had no conscious inner experience, which I think is quite interesting. So that is something I did talk about. So I did kind of touch on some of the more philosophical issues.
Thank you for your answers. And I think we will go and try to answer some of the questions from our readers. And we have a question on ethics in AI, and we have live Brenda, who is leading AI at FPF. And Brenda, do you have any thoughts on ethics and how it relates to AI, or some considerations?
Yeah, sure. So coming to you from Capitol Hill, where I can assure you that zooming in on humans does not always yield signs of intelligence. But, you know, we've had some great hearings today with a lot of thoughtful people giving really good answers as well. So I think there is hopefully hope for the future in that regard as well. I think that it's a great indicator. Martin already mentioned a couple, the Future of Humanity at Oxford and OpenAI. There's AI Now in New York City. There's Data and Society. There's 2 or 3 different ethics, AI and ethics centers, like specifically just to look at ethics and AI, that have sprung up all within the last really like 2 years around the world. And I think this is an indication of how important everyone understands this is, to get this right, to think through these issues, not just at a scientific or design and developmental level. In other words, you know, can we program machines to do these things, but how do we do it thoughtfully? What are the risks? How do we integrate that into our communities, into our society, into our rule of law? I follow and chat with David Gunkel on Twitter and other formats a lot, who has written a lot about robot rights. What would that mean? What would that look like? And he's, you know, definitely not a crazy person out there talking about, you know, things that do make you feel sort of silly if you address them. But the legitimate questions of agency and how this is going to look when we have AI systems that have such levels of complexity that we have to integrate them into our existing systems in some way. And so I take a lot of encouragement from the fact that there's so many really serious, thoughtful people who are from disciplines outside computer science, but familiar with it, who can augment and parallel those conversations. I think it came up implicitly in the book. There wasn't a lot of direct conversation about ethics exactly, but there was a lot of values-based comments and making life of humans better and things like that. So I would definitely be interested in Martin's thoughts on what he took away from talking with these AI experts on the ethics aspect of that.
Right. I think they're enormously concerned with that. I think all of them are. I mean, you know, all of them, for example, were very concerned about the potential for bias in algorithms. Many people are working on that. Nearly all of them mentioned that. Weaponization, many of them are incredibly passionate. As I say in the book, there was a recent petition or you know, a letter addressed, I think, at the United Nations that was signed by thousands of individual artificial intelligence researchers and also hundreds of AI companies, promising basically to never work on autonomous weapons. So I do think that the ethical issues are very much in their mind. I will tell you one takeaway that I have from this is that these are basically very decent, very good people. I feel very good about the fact that these individuals are the ones that are actually doing this research. I think they're all very concerned about making sure that the fruits of what they're building is applied in a way that makes humanity better off. None of them are interested in, you know, I think they're very ambitious people, but ambitious in a way that a scientist would be ambitious. I think every single one of these people would like to be the next Einstein, the person that, you know, invents AGI or is famous. Sure, they have that level of competition between each other intellectually as a scientist might, but none of them are interested in world domination or using these technologies in nefarious ways or even becoming super wealthy, although many of them are of course quite wealthy already. I think that they are genuinely focused on building a technology that is going to benefit humanity and will benefit everyone. I think that they would all agree that they want to build something that will help everyone at every level of their society. They don't want to build something that is going to become a tool of the super rich and leave everyone else behind. I think they're all very focused on that. So I think that we can take some sense of relief that the people working on that have that outlook. And that was really genuinely my impression from talking to these people. Just another point I'll make is that I am becoming more optimistic that these issues are going to kind of enter this public sphere. You, Brenda, you said you're from Capitol Hill. I've been there too. A year or so ago, I met with a group of Congress people, all Democrats, unfortunately, that are really concerned about these issues. So I think it is beginning to enter that sphere, that it's getting awareness. I don't know if you've heard of a guy named Andrew Yang, but he's running for president as a Democratic candidate. And obviously he's not one of the main people, but he has raised quite a lot of money and is actually polling, I understand, high enough that he may have a good chance of being able to participate in the debates. And he's a big proponent, for example, of a universal basic income. He talks all the time about the impact of AI and robotics and automation. So there's a chance, that in the 2020 campaign, these issues are going to get injected into the public discourse. I think that could happen as soon as 2020. So I do think that there's reason for optimism that these issues are kind of coming to the forefront, and we are hopefully going to begin to have the kind of public discussion and debate that we need to have about something that's going to be so disruptive to our society.
Great. And this next question, I'm going to hand off actually to Michael first, and then anyone else can weigh in. And that question is, given that the law doesn't seem to keep up with technology, what are the chances that we see regulations on AI, particularly also relating to GDPR impact on AI?
Yeah, cool. So I sort of contest that the law doesn't keep up with technology. Sometimes it doesn't, but the law is often, recently we've seen the law maybe fails to keep up with business models, not really the technologies inside. So GDPR is really just a small change of a law that has been existing in Europe since 1995, which has governed automated decision-making and has governed decisions that are made without a human involved. So we've had laws, and in France we've had laws on automated decision-making and algorithmic treatment of people since the 1970s. So there's a long heritage of actually trying to regulate this, and to do so, I think, in a more principled way. So often the solution is to work from principles. So GDPR is often accused of not being able to deal with new technologies. I see in the comments someone's mentioned blockchain, but the fact is it is a principled law, and it's actually its inability to deal with these has been overstated to some degree. And as long as I think we establish quite strong principles and mechanisms of achieving those principles through regulators, through enforcement mechanisms, through rights and so on, we can stay aligned quite well with new technologies as they come about. It doesn't mean that we have to regulate the technologies themselves. I think very, very few people, if anyone, are suggesting that you go in and you say you regulate researchers, or you say you can't use deep learning, or you can't use support vector machines. Instead, you sort of take a step back, and it's going to be a hard battle, and we're going to work out and do a lot of learning. But yeah, I would say go back to principles like fairness, legality, sometimes transparency, accountability, and empower regulators and also courts to think about these problems.
Great. And Mark, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, a quick comment on the question on regulation. It's pretty clear that there's going to have to be a regulatory net thrown over applications of artificial intelligence. They're being used everywhere, and the famous phrase is it's the general purpose technology of our time. But it's precisely for that reason that there shouldn't be a single regulatory framework that gets developed for it. I think the idea that artificial intelligence will vanish off into the woodwork like our electrical outlets is probably right. But it'll still be used in 1,001 domains. It'll be used in employment. It'll be used in healthcare. It'll be used in personalized learning in our schools. It will be used in weapons. And in each of those domains, there are going to be enormous ethical and public policy questions that have to be resolved. New questions that haven't been with us with the previous level of technology. And so the regulatory agencies that are responsible for employment law or credit law or the Defense Department that has to deploy autonomous weapons, they're going to have their ethical work cut out for them and their policy work cut out for them. And they're going to have to make some pretty tough ethical and policy choices. But if you try to approach that from the top down and say, here are the principles that apply to artificial intelligence as such, it's sort of like saying, let's regulate the application of regression analysis, in every domain where it's ever used. Here are the principles for regression analysis. I think it's just operating at a level of abstraction that won't be useful or helpful. But that doesn't mean you don't do anything. It means that it operates at the level of particular specific domains and particular specific regulatory agencies.
Yeah, I'll just inject that I agree, and I talk to many people about this, and that's generally the main takeaway is that applications clearly need to be regulated. I mean, obviously it would be unthinkable not to regulate self-driving cars or uses in medicine or weaponization and so forth. But we don't want to regulate the basic research or have something too overreaching. We certainly don't want to see with AI what we saw, for example, with stem cell research, that kind of thing, where we really halt progress in the field. For one thing, that would put us at a disadvantage relative to China, right? Because they're probably not going to adopt the same regulations. So we definitely don't want to be too overreaching there, but we do need to regulate the specific applications.
One thing that just quickly adds that doesn't often get talked about, and again in the book, is competition law. So one thing that there is, I think, a need to regulate is really that organizations put their actions where their mouth is if they're talking about democratizing technology, because it is really then about innovation and the ability of individuals to steer innovation. And if AI is going to become like electricity is largely a public infrastructure, and we have to wonder how we regulate public infrastructures. Do we allow access to information about public infrastructures? If they're really that important, whose hands are they in and who makes decisions about the way that they're deployed? I think these are quite interesting questions going forwards that can be spanning multiple sectors.
And thank you all for your great comments and questions. And we've been seeing a lot of comments / questions from our readers about risks of AI, whether that's will we have fair algorithms or will there be any stereotypes, the weaponization? And as a common question for our panelists or author, do you think these risks are overestimated, or what do you think about the potential risks of AI?
I guess I'll start. I think the risks are very real and we should take them very seriously. However, I nonetheless am an optimist, and I think that the benefits from artificial intelligence are going to outweigh the risks. And one thing I always give is the quote from Demis Hassabis. He says that he wants to first solve the problem of intelligence or artificial intelligence and use that to solve everything else, meaning, clean energy and climate change and poverty and all these incredibly important challenges that we face. Artificial intelligence is going to become arguably the most important tool we have to solve those problems. So the last thing we want to do is slow progress down or step away from it or be so afraid of it that we don't allow progress to happen. But we do have to take these risks very seriously. There definitely are going to be spaces where government regulation is going to be required. It's going to be important to have a public discourse and examine the trade-offs. For example, with facial recognition technologies, what are the trade-offs that we're willing to accept between being safe and secure and losing our privacy, right? These are issues that are going to be incredibly important, and they're very real.
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done in the area of bias, and whether algorithms can be designed sort of in principle to be free of bias. But even there, I do think that that's a risk that is being formulated at too high a level. Fairness is not something that really applies to algorithms. It applies, to human processes of decision making. And so what's fair in the context of a school might be different than what's fair in the context of allocating health care, or what's fair in the context of the criminal justice system. And these are not technical questions. And there's a tendency for computer scientists especially, and this is a point that was made most recently by Andrew Selbst in a paper on this topic. There's a tendency of computer scientists to want to get generic solutions. So they want to say, we've certified this algorithm as fair, which means you can use it in any context because it's an algorithm, and algorithms can be used in any context. But I do think we need to focus very, very specifically on what the algorithm is being used for, what the AI system is trying to do, and what social perceptions of fairness and justice are in the particular domain of application. And it's that whole social context that has to be rendered a fair or just social context. And it can't be just abstracting the algorithm and treating that as an element in and of itself that can be imported from the outside as a fair algorithm, and thereby making the whole system fair. And I do think that that's an area where you have to move beyond the technical issues. You have to talk to the lawyers, you have to talk to the philosophers, you have to talk to the business people, you have to talk to the policymakers.
I agree strongly with Mark on that. I think it's the fairness work has been very sector agnostic, and that's problematic. But I also think that Demis Hassabis is talking nonsense when he talks about solving climate change, solving energy. You can create machine learning systems that might help particular technical developments in those fields. However, these problems they share one characteristic, which is related to fairness, which is that they are political. We cannot decide on the ends of what we want to get to. We can't decide in climate change who wins and who loses, whose values are prioritized. What kind of cities do we want to live in? Do we want to live in cities populated with cars, or do we want to live in cities populated with pedestrian spaces? And in fact, different groups of society win and lose. Sometimes AI might be able to turn things into a win-win situation, but with technologies, we've often seen that that's not the case. So we've seen that when we create a win-win situation somewhere else, we create distributive situations elsewhere. So we have to think, I think, especially around, for example, who benefits from these technologies, who are they designed to aid? Even in the development of AI, who is building and labeling these training sets? When we look at pharmaceuticals, this moved very quickly through regulatory arbitrage to developing countries where areas of high precarity were used to do clinical trials in. And are we going to see the same thing with training data sets for AI systems? And if so, how do we cope with that?
Well, I'll just respond. I don't think he means that AI can solve political problems. He's talking about innovation, right? That probably the best path we had to solving climate change is really going to be innovation. And I do think that AI, not just narrowly machine learning, but also remember that there's a focus here on something that begins to look more like artificial general intelligence. That will be an enormous boost to scientific innovation, technical innovation, building clean energy sources that can be competitive with fossil fuels. And that's probably the single most important thing we can do to address those issues. So I do think there's a lot of reason for optimism there.
Yeah, I think there's just one thing that I have that ran through some of the interviews with the idea that AGI might reason, and yes, it could help scientific innovation, though we haven't often seen that. And indeed, some of the interviewees say that where there's good models, you're unlikely to see benefits from machine learning. But it's almost this feeling that AI might help us better organize societies. If we had AGI, we could make a city that is organized in a better way. And these are really political decisions. And so this fallacy that we can split the political from the scientific, I think, continues in some of the work of people working in AI today.
I have one final question for Martin, if I could. You laid out in the book a lot of different opinions on the learning folk versus the rules-based folks as the path forward for making progress. What do you think? I know it may seem to be a scientific question, and one that the experts disagree on. But what's your take? What's the best way forward if we're going to make progress in the field?
My view is that some sort of a hybrid approach is probably best. I mean, I think that deep learning clearly has got enormous potential. It's been a completely disruptive technology that's done amazing things. But I also think that there are ideas, in symbolic logic manipulation and so forth that can be very important and might represent a shortcut. It could be possible that both groups are correct, that the real deep learning adherence to people that believe building systems based on neural networks that are fundamentally modeled, more or less on the brain is really what it's all about. That's the path forward. And maybe it's true that eventually that would get us there, but maybe it's possible that by bringing in some ideas from other areas of AI, in particular, symbolic reasoning and so forth, we can accelerate that. And that I think is one of the another interview I'd say that is really worth reading if you're interested in this stuff is with Josh Tenenbaum, who's a super smart guy at MIT that really thinks about these issues. And his interview is maybe a bit dense compared to some of the others, but he really delves a lot into this particular issue and has some viewpoints that I think make a lot of sense. So my view is that the future will involve bringing in ideas from both sides, and that will probably be the best way to approach it.
Well, I think that's time for us. Thank you so much, Martin, for joining us for the entire hour. It was a great book, great topic. It was a really engaging discussion today. Mm-hmm. And thank you, Michael, from dialing in from London, and Mark for coming in, Brenda. And thank you for all the book club members who joined and came in with great questions and comments. As a one last announcement, we will be having our next book club in April 24th, and we have the book chosen by you. We will be discussing habeas data, and we'll send out more information on the date and time. Thank you all for joining, and if you have any further recommendations for our next book, please let us know.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michael, for writing the book.
Leave meeting for all.